the hurt doesn't show, but the pain still grows. Some strangers to you and me.
I am so sorry to cut you off, Phil, but let's just rewind a bit to... You're listening to a song called Only the Lonely by Roy Orbison. You're also listening to a great example of a song that was recorded dry.
There goes my baby.
You hear the ringing after the shots? That's not reverb. That's a bell to simulate reverb. For the most part, this song sounds, well, I guess a bit like a wafer stick. Reverb is basically when the sound waves coming out of your little instrument there go into the mic, but they also bounce around the walls a few gajillion times and then go into the mic. The closer the mic to what you're recording, the drier the sound. Back in those days, if you wanted reverb, you had to go into a special room called an echo chamber. That's just a fancy way of saying empty room with a mic far away from your instrument. So, if you wanted to record a certain type of reverb-filled sound, you had to have an appropriate room. So some clever people in the 60s thought, well, what if we take advantage of the naturally occurring spring reverb in an amp? That first thing you heard, that's spring reverb. And spring reverb isn't always going to cut it, so another solution was plate reverb. Hear the reverb on that piano? The drums? That's done through a vibrating sheet of metal. But in 1981, reverb goes digital. The RMX 16 from AMS gets released. Now, suddenly, you can fit an echo chamber in a tiny box. You can fit a concert hall in a tiny box. Enter the age of reverb. The use of reverb was definitely one of the sounds that defined the 80s. I mean, it's kind of like a kid getting a toy they've always wanted for the first time. Aside from reverb technology becoming more accessible, there were a couple other major players that shaped 80s music. Let's talk about synths for a second. Back in the 60s and 70s, synths were analog, not digital. They used oscillators to produce different kinds of sound wave signals. That means they could get out of tune if they got too hot or too cold, or if their feelings got hurt. Hey, 1 in 5 synthesizers go abused. That's not okay. Don't be mean to your synths. Reach out. They were also pretty expensive, so in the 80s when synth technology became more available and consistent, but wow, it's almost like there's one ingredient missing. Oh yeah, back to Phil. Those drums you're hearing were part of the special sauce that made the 80s the 80s. Phil Collins used a technique called gated reverb on live drums. Gated reverb made its way onto everything, but drums were hard to set up in the recording studio, time was money, they took up space, and they were also pretty hard to record. So with the proliferation of drum machines, tiny boxes that made it easy to play the drums, everyone and their goldfish had access to that 80s drum sound. At the same time the 80s were drumming away in a corner, new wave and post-punk were doing their own thing. Of course, they took advantage of the technology for reverb and synths and so forth, but you can hear the difference for yourself. Bands like Echo and the Bunnymen, XTC, and Joy Division we're kicking it. And that's why the 80s sound like the 80s. Okay, bye.